dark retreats are like going into the womb. You actually feel the state of your soul. All your fears, all your inner demons, all your hopes, all your joys, you're gonna feel them and also see them on this canvas of darkness. It was such a powerful light that wanted to move through me. There was like no option. At times I would cry because the light was putting so much pressure on my ego. If there wasn't fear, there wouldn't be any courage needed. This ocean that we're swimming in called life or the universe seems to have a quality of love. It seems to have this deep goodness to it. It's not something the mind creates. As you follow your heart, you start seeing this holy dynamism of the universe, that it's always transforming. Just like you can't witness your own funeral, you cannot be there to witness your own enlightenment. People ask me, so what did you find all these thousands of hours of meditation? And the most simple answer I can give is that I found that there is nothing to find. And I just came back down, living life with a different kind of fullness. There was this mountain climber who had this beautiful quote. I think his name was René Dumalt. And he said, so what's the point of reaching these peaks? Like you climb these mountains and you reach these peaks. In the end, you got to come down again, right? He said, you can't stay on the peak forever. At some point, you got to come down from the mountain. But then the question is, what's the point? And his answer was quite profound. He said, well, the point is that you know what's up there. The person who hasn't gone to the peak and come down doesn't actually know what's up there.
Sounds like going to the top of the mountain is a bit of a summit, but going and spending 100 days in darkness is going deep, deep within. Um, you referred to knowing what's up there. So were you looking for what's in there?
Yeah, what drove me really was this question of there should be more to life. So I had become relatively successful at age 23, reached like 90% of my goals. Everything was really awesome on the surface. I'd become an engineer and had a thriving coaching business, one of the biggest ones in Scandinavia, was making a lot of money, doing work that I really enjoyed, serving people. And everything was just beautiful. Like everything that society prescribes is going to make you happy was all there. And instead of bringing happiness, it plummeted me into this existential crisis at age 23 where I was like, oh man, this didn't work. And not only it didn't work, I also had this knowing that doing more of it won't work. It was so painfully obvious that just making more money or having more experiences wasn't going to help me. And I was very skeptical about spirituality. I was not like, I really had a lot of judgments and skepticism about anything spiritual, but it was an act of desperation. It was like, well, this is the last arena I feel I haven't really explored with intensity and with passion. So that's what originally started me on this incredible journey that spanned more than 14 years. Like a lot of crazy experiences, meeting a lot of beautiful people, a lot of weird people, all sorts of like the full spectrum, the full rainbow colored spectrum. And the dark retreats were really driven by that same fire to search for something. It was like a desperation of something is missing, but it was also this ancient knowing that I think every one of us have somewhere, that there is something I lost connection to, or there is some deeper truth that I know is possible. And that some people call that the enlightenment drive. That was also driving me. And it just so happened that I have a very extreme personality, very intense. So that drive took me to these depths of, well, I don't care what I have to do to find these answers. So yes, the dark retreats are like going into the womb. You're basically removing all distractions, right? We distract ourselves so much for so many things, like checking my smartphone every 5 minutes, food, even beautiful connections and conversations, although very nourishing, can be a form of distraction. When you go into the darkness, there are two elements. The first element is you're removing all distractions. So it's an absence of distractions. When you remove distractions, you become face to face with your actual soul state. You actually feel the state of your soul because there's nothing to, you're not running anymore from you. The second element is the darkness itself. Darkness has a profound effect on the human physiology, the nervous system, the brain. The first 4 to 5 days, you have huge spikes of melatonin, so you go into a deeply restful state. And around day 8, 9, 10, you have huge releases of DMT. So it's basically a very intense psychedelic trip, but the practice that I went in there to do is how to stay clear, to not get lost in these hallucinations, these visionary experiences. And that's how the Tibetan Buddhists usually use it. They go in there to see the mind kind of, because your mind is going to start projecting its whole subconsciousness, all your fears, all your inner demons, all your hopes, all your joys. You're going to feel them and in a way also see them on this canvas of darkness. So it's like a direct confrontation with your own psyche.
Fascinating to hear, and even just the reset component of it. I'm sure there's someone tuning into this podcast going, "How did you eat? Like, what did you like? How do you navigate the darkness with like
Yes.
nutrition, basic needs? Like, how did you navigate some of those more basic things?"
Those are the classical questions. How did you shower? How did you poop? How do you eat? It's a
I'm
good
sure there's a
question.
more enlightening question I could have asked.
No, but no, we got to keep it practical, and everybody goes there, and I get it, and it's surprising how adaptable our nervous system is. So basically, what happens in the darkness is, first of all, your calorie consumption goes down by about 30% because you're simply, or your energy expenditure rather, because the visual cortex is spending around 30% of the calories you eat daily. The energy goes to your visual cortex and your sense of vision.
Wow.
So as you kind of, you're not using your visual cortex in there. Your physical eyes, your inner eye is opening. So therefore you just don't get that hungry. On top, you're not moving a lot typically, right? I was lying mostly down, doing a little bit of stretching and sitting. So you don't get that hungry. And once the spiritual energies really get activated, of course, that's also like a fasted state, as I'm sure many people on your podcast have been fasting. You just don't get hungry that much. So I was eating mostly fruits, and my longest retreat in one sequence was 49 days. That's the highest kind of retreat they usually do, the longest duration. And I was eating mostly fruits. I had a little like protein bar or something just to get a little bit of protein. And I had a good friend. This 49-day retreat was when I lived up on the mountain. I turned my house, which was kind of built into the mountain. So it was like a luxury modern cave, you could call it, with a shower and a bathroom and a bed, etc. And I had a friend that would bring up food for me once a week. It's a double door system, so she opens one door, puts the food, closes the door, and then I could go and grab it without any light coming in. And one of the surprising things in dark retreats is it's really difficult to remove all light. Once you start kind of turning off the lights and covering over the main sources, you notice all these light leaks that are coming in from small cracks. So you got to cover all of that in. There's no light at all. If you take your fingers in front of your eyes, you cannot see the number you have. The second challenge, other than removing all the light, is getting a good flow of oxygen in without light. So you have different systems for that. But once you're in the darkness, your other senses just kick in. So you feel a lot, you feel your way to the bathroom, uh, and you're just operating through these other senses. So I was eating a couple of pieces of fruit every day and a bar. That was it. And then once a week, because you can write notes to your friend in the dark, so you write notes, and it's very funny to see all your notes when you come out because you think you wrote something, you're like, what is this, I can't even read it. And I would write a note once a week. I would ask for a special treat. So she would bring me from the local cafe like a rice and avocado or some vegan salad. And that really kept me going. The human mind is a funny thing. So when you remove all distractions, it has this one thing that it looks forward to. All right, let me just stick in there for a week and I'm going to have like avocado and rice.
Yeah, profound. And the reset component of it, you mentioned
Yes.
lightly there, like your whole system begins to reset. I mean, even with the Vipassana, like there's a lot of light, but even just quietening down, the speech, like having 10 days where you just like not
Yeah.
talking, and just kind of watching all the internal dialogues just come to a real head, before they start to dissipate. I mean, like you said, you're going through these visual experiences where you're seeing so much on the canvas of the darkness, and processing all of that. But then also your body must have been going through some, because your background is also like, coaching, but also like significant amounts of like health, wellness, fitness, like personal training type sort of background. Like your body must have gone through some very interesting resets.
100%. And I would recommend most people to do at least 1 or 2 days maybe. I mean, it's an advanced practice, so you want to be very careful. It's not something you just want to jump into. There can be very negative consequences if you don't know how to meditate and be with your subconscious. But one of the most significant things in form of the reset that I experienced, Amrit, was it's really astounding to me how much we're affected energetically by the people and the context around us. And I wasn't aware of how much that was until I was in the darkness by myself. And I noticed even certain friends I had that I didn't speak with were I was being influenced by their field. And so when I was in the darkness for the first time, I had this sense of, oh my God, this is what my energy field feels like when it's really detached from everything else. It's, for me at least, and I think for many people, it's very hard to have a sense of yourself truly when you are in context. And I think that's natural. We affect each other. Of course, we respond to each other's needs. So even people who are not spiritually interested, if you can take like 4 hours or a day and have that kind of detachment and just, it can really realign your vision, remind you, what am I about? Where am I even going? Without the influence of other people. So that's extremely powerful. Now, to the physical side, yes, your body goes through atrophy, your muscles kind of dwindle down. Those were the main things. There was a deep reset. I had deep injuries that I had in my shoulders heal in there. I felt tremendous heat and light start moving up, and then I just had like a healed shoulder. So the body's natural intelligence just kicks in, and it's like, finally, like I just have some time to just go inward, to move these pranas, the life force, inward instead of it going outward, and start doing some repair work.
It's really interesting that you're referring to, um, yeah, the body's innate healing ability, um, in a state void of distractions, because you've mentioned that we live in a state of normalized sickness out in everyday living. Can you expand on this idea and its spiritual implications for us? This normalized sickness.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's so fascinating how anything we exist in for long enough, kind of, we just stop noticing it. Like for the people who are dealing with chronic pain, first of all, my heart goes out to you. I had chronic pain for 3 months pretty intensely recently. I got help and it's gone now, but it was such a beautiful teaching for how much that can affect you and how much your attentional force just goes to like fixing that. And but my point is, once you're in chronic pain, or once you gain a little bit too much weight, or you lose your flexibility, or you become used to just having constant neurotic or anxious thoughts, you just stop noticing it because it's your normal. You don't have any contrast, right? And I think to a large degree we become so disconnected from what feels natural, what feels aligned to, not only from an evolutionary standpoint for our physiology, but also for our soul signature, which for each one of us is a unique purpose, is a unique flavor that we want to unfold in this life. And I think the side effect that we do feel is the suffering. There is a silent suffering, and we might try to drown it with food or success or relationships or addictions or sexual meetings and encounters or even spirituality. That can also be a kind of addiction. I think that's that's the side effect most of us notice. But even deeper than that, there is this calling home. There is this calling back to a deeper signature that is going to be different for each of us. Each of us have our own rhythm, just like our fingerprints are unique. Each one of us have a particular rhythm that is good and right for us.
Hey there, Inspired Soul. Just wanted to take a quick second out to thank all of you that are subscribed to the channel. Everything you see around here is powered and empowered by your subscription to this channel. Thank you so much for your love and support. To all of you that haven't yet subscribed, please do take a moment. As I'm saying the word subscribe, the subscribe button below is lighting up in the colors of the Inspired Evolution. Please hit that button, hit the bell notification icon, support us, help us in promoting love, positivity, and wisdom around the world simply through your subscription. Thank you so much in advance. Back to Mateo. Yeah, it's fascinating. And you wrote, is it the awareness method that you wrote in 14 days? Or is it the, oh, yeah.
The Mind Made Prison was my first book. I wrote that in 14 days, and it reached more than 100,000 people. And it was just this rhythm that we're talking about. I had never written a book. I didn't know what I was doing, and I just got this calling, you need to write this book. And it was such a powerful light that wanted to move through me. There was like no option. My ego really wanted to resist writing that, but I was living in Turkey at the time, and I basically locked myself, quote unquote, in my room, and I said I won't come out until a chapter is written. And I would do that every day, and at times I would cry because it was just the light was putting so much pressure on my ego. I'm sure many of the viewers can relate. When we go through these evolutionary transformation, these leaps in our evolution, the light of our soul, or the light and the forward momentum of development, the developmental force itself, it stretches our ego, because the reason we're not in that next stage yet is because we're holding ourselves together in a particular way. So that needs to be stretched. It's just like asanas, like yoga postures. It hurts when you're stretching, right? It hurts, but if the moment it hurts, you go to your mind and say, "Oh, there is something wrong. It shouldn't. It's not supposed to hurt." Or when you're in the gym and you're lifting weight, you conclude, "This isn't supposed to hurt, and why am I sore the next day?" And if you quit, well, you're not going to grow. You're not going to move into that next evolutionary stage.
Yeah, there's this really interesting piece that I've never really interfaced with until I came across your work, which was you say that the mind is actually built upon the heart, which kind of flabbergasted me a little bit because I've been doing these episodes and having these conversations for quite some time. And there's this phrase that I hear a lot in spiritual circles and in community, and it's a return to the heart. It's a return to the heart. And believe it or not, people would say this, but what I actually was hearing, and I didn't realize that I wasn't hearing it correctly until I interfaced with your work, that I was just hearing, oh, it's a journey to the heart. It's a journey to the heart, not this component of a return. And so the return became really interesting as I was like getting deeper into your work. It was like, oh, there's a return. Oh, we started in the heart. Can you explain kind of what I'm scratching at here? Because this was really interesting for me to come across.
Sure, sure. It's a very fascinating thing you're bringing up, Amrit. It's really, this question is really the question, the ultimate question that we're exploring here. This question of return to the heart. What does it mean? And it's something tremendously obvious on a common sense level, but also tremendously complex for the mind to discuss. Actually, the mind will never understand it because we're speaking about what's prior to the mind. But if we look at it, if we break it down logically, if you look at an infant, they don't yet have a sense of self, right? They're just in this undifferentiated state, which, by the way, is not the same state that we want to return to in mature awakening. But that's a side note. Maybe we can revisit. But they're in this undifferentiated state of oneness, right? And they actually have to learn to differentiate between subject, me, and object, mother. So that's a gradual process that starts developing psychologically, and the baby starts having a sense of, okay, well, these limbs seem to be controlled by me, and I can grab for things out there that are objects. That's how the psychology gradually starts evolving. So the obviousness is, well, the psychology is evolving out of the undifferentiated oneness, right? It's obvious to everyone. It wasn't there to begin with, right? If you go to a child and say Amrit or Mateo, it doesn't know to identify with that. So when we talk about the return to the heart, it's really just realizing that undifferentiated oneness. But what happens in adulthood, because the ego and the mind is not a mistake, it's a psychological development that we all have to go through. It gives us functionality, right? We don't want to be a drooling baby in an adult body that cannot take care of themselves, cannot have responsibilities, healthy individuated relationships, etc. But what can happen as we develop that ego functioning and take it to a certain height, the next stage of evolution is actually that we can be in that undifferentiated oneness simultaneously with individuated functioning.
This becomes ever more fascinating when you start looking at. There's a politer way to put this, and pardon me because I'm just going to hack my way through the question because I don't know of a better way to put it. Um, but you see some people getting stuck in their personal evolution at certain points, and I think maybe we're all stuck to some degree because we're all on a journey, and karmically, it's where we're at and how we're evolving. But you sort of see emotional patterns within an individual kind of getting stuck at a certain, and you can sort of see, I'm not talking to an adult right now, even though this is an adult. I can see I'm speaking to like an overactivated, like 14-year-old or 7-year-old, because we have these emotional wounds and traumas in some way that sort of get packed in. Your awareness around those sticking points that we experience on our path of evolution.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And the spiritual ego is, of course, one of the most subtle and difficult things to work with because we find a sense of self-importance in that, which also is not bad. It's an evolutionary stage, but it's good to be aware of this. So the way I view it is the psychological evolution and how I even view the process of enlightenment or soul awakening. I like to call it just a process of human maturation. It's a natural developmental journey that is possible for all of us. It happens through scaffolding. So it's very difficult to, maybe even impossible, to, in a truly embodied way, have compassion for others if I haven't learned compassion for self. If we talk about it in the chakra model, it's very difficult to be in the heart truly in a stable, embodied, consistent way if I haven't learned the lessons of the solar plexus, which is about individuality, boundaries, individual will, because that plexus energy, the undigested energy of competitiveness or drive, willpower, is always going to keep pulling me down. It's going to pull the energy down. So I can't live in that heartfulness fully. Just as it's very hard to stay in the heart if the root chakra feels unsafe. So there is this process of scaffolding that we get to go through. And in each stage of the journey, um, each time we come into a greater soul alignment or greater soul light, love, power, peace, all these beautiful qualities, charisma, the old wounding that is yet undigested is going to usurp that. It's going to take it personally. It's going to kind of come in and be like, oh, I always knew I was so great. So to cover over the kind of lack that is still undigested. And those places, and that is not a mistake. That is fine. We just want to be aware that that is part of the journey so that those places of lack can be seen, they can be loved, and they can be integrated. Because truly, this is not about us. And when I say us, I mean the experience of us that we have through those places of lack. If we speak about it in a more absolute sense, it is absolutely about us. It is absolutely about the one, the one's journey through experiencing itself, through wounding, through lack, through self importance, grandiosity, shame, but to hopefully gradually unwind through that experience and come back to the cosmic humor that there is only me here and I am relating just to myself.
Hi there, guys. I wanted to take a quick moment just to introduce you to my one-to-one coaching. It's something that I deeply love doing. As you can tell, conscious conversation is such a massive part of my life. And having one-to-one, deep, meaningful conversations with people where I get to show up as your brother or as the coach or as your mentor has been such a gift for me personally and a gift for lots of the people that I have supported on the journey of living a more spiritually empowered, spiritually powered, spiritually aligned life. You don't have to take my word for it. Here's some examples of people all around the world that have experienced profound transformations through this coaching experience.
Amrit is a fantastic coach.
In a few sessions, he got to a depth that I'd only experienced before working with certain medicines.
He's gone through a lot of the struggles that you're probably facing, and Amrit's been a really strong, supportive figure in my journey.
In control of myself.
I'm kinder to myself.
I actually have that vision and a purpose.
I do feel like I'm a better version of myself already.
Amazing energy.
He was easy to talk to, which made me easy to trust him.
Working with Amrit at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and really I was bouncing out of bed.
Whenever I get off the calls with Amrit, best money we've ever spent.
I would not recommend him because I don't want everyone to know about him and then I won't be able to book him. If he gets too busy, I won't get my turn.
I would say absolutely.
There's no way you can work with Amrit for a period of time without being transformed.
So if you're considering him as a coach, do not hesitate, because you won't be disappointed.
Alrighty, so hopefully that's inspiring your evolution onwards and upwards. And if you are so inspired to evolve, you can book in a one-to-one call with me directly at www.amrit.coach/life. And guys, if I can say so myself, I do think this is something quite special. Most people that I see building things online don't really work with people this deeply, this intimately, one-on-one as things start to grow, just because it is so time intensive. And yet I'm so deeply passionate about the transformation that comes from one-to-one coaching that just isn't available anywhere else. It would be my absolute honor and a pleasure to support your spiritual awakening, your spiritual path, your spiritual unfoldment. It is my life's work. I look forward to seeing you in the call. Back to today's podcast. Do you think we're collectively going through a shift? Because you mentioned the chakras, and it does seem like, and maybe it's just, I may not be the right barometer on this, because obviously running and being part of this ecosystem, which is Inspired Evolution, is a very touchwood privileged place to be, I feel. But it does seem like there seems to be a bit of a shift collectively. And as you were defining some of the energies of the solar plexus, it does seem like maybe humanity is kind of shifting a little bit into being more heart-centered at large. Like we were just describing the individuals sort of make up. Do you think collectively there's some shifts happening, and could you speak to that somewhat?
I think 100% there are shifts happening. And one of the interesting things about shift is any shift is that we often become fixated on what we're shifting into. So for example, as we're shifting from the plexus into the heart, because we haven't completed the shift fully, just as an example, then the mind also gets mixed into the shift often, and it becomes a kind of insistence or tightness, for example, on heart qualities. And that is also part of the process. But eventually, when the shift is fully integrated, the self-importance or the fixation around it releases, because it's no longer seen as a contrast or polarity to something else. So when the heart is more and more fully integrated, it has great capacity to include, for example, willpower, individual boundaries, and individual force even. But as it's going through that transition, there is often a rejection of the prior evolutionary stage in order to come into the new.
So this is a question that's sort of percolating on all fronts, because as we're drawn towards a shift, we're kind of, like we're enamored and we sort of go through the shift, but then also we reject some of the old, and the mind is doing this thing in order to pull us forward. in some ways to get to this next phase, but then also there's an element of surrender where eventually we land there and it's so comfortable it just becomes the status quo. And the reason I'm double clicking on that at the moment is also because you mentioned previously at the beginning when you were going through the retreats in darkness, and it was like you mentioned the quote, and part of me forgetting the gentleman's name that summited the mountains, and you had his quote, it's like you summit the mountain to know what it's like at the top, and then coming back down. And you also mentioned that after consistent seeking, there's nothing to be looking for. It's really this profound point. And so this dynamic of like stretch forth and, to find your own hand sort of looking back at, to grab onto. And in some degrees, I'm conscious as I'm speaking to it, it sounds like a folly. And yet it seems like there is this really deep human drive that guides us, I don't want to say along the folly, but along the path, and you called it potentially the drive to enlightenment. I just wanted to double click on that and get your thoughts in this space.
I love that word folly because, I mean, to me it's supposed to be a folly, right? That's part of the humor of this thing. I mean, my heart goes out to myself in times of deep suffering and anybody who is in suffering right now, right? I wouldn't go and say to someone, well, it's just all a cosmic joke when they're in deep suffering, because it's not in that moment. That's not what their experience is at. But as the experience becomes more subtle, you just look back on your own suffering, and you're like, why did I do that? It's so clear that it was all mind created, and we are in a kind of paradise. Like, no matter our life situation, we all have challenges on all levels of society. There's always challenges, and we cannot look at someone's life from outside and well judge that, well, their life is perfect. Everybody has challenges because this is samsara. Even if you have the perfect life, then you lack meaning. Then you're like, well, what's the meaning of it all? That's your torture. Someone who's struggling with not having food, that's their struggle and torture. So there is these struggles on every level of evolution. And then hopefully those struggles can push us forward to ascend this ladder of development and gradually come to a place of wholeness where we can see the humor in it all. But it's not a detached humor. That's the key. It's not a humor that has gone beyond everything and is just sitting on a throne laughing at everyone else's suffering or the suffering of reality. It's a humor. It's a compassion that can cry with people, that can cry with oneself, that can live fully and be fully part of life, fully engaged, not taking the cheap route of protecting the ego by just sitting back, fully engaged, fully bleeding, fully crying, fully laughing, while knowing that this is a game.
Yeah, the concept of the mind-made prison is really taking form in this conversation. And yet, interestingly, I've had some conversations with some people on the podcast recently where it seems like trying to leave the mind is also, it's not the way out, actually. It seems like it's about understanding that you're going to be playing in mind as long as you're aware and conscious. It's about developing a certain relationship with the mind. Your thoughts on that, and then potentially some key tenets for working with mind.
Yes, I mean, in my more naive phases of the journey, I can be quite idealistic. So I had all these ideals about, well, I'm just going to dissolve my mind and my ego, and I'm going to live in a state of bliss forever. And as far as I can see now, it is more like what you say. It's about coming into relationship with everything rather than eliminating it, because that kind of thinking can be a self-hatred, right? Trying to get rid of one aspect of existence as if it is not God. The mind, in from the absolute perspective, is God in motion. It's the wave. The wave is never separate from the ocean. So yes, there is a stage initially where it's helpful to kind of even reject the mind, quote unquote, just to find some peace beyond it and kind of discern, oh, that's just the mind, that's just the ego, I am beyond it. But in the higher stages of evolution, you're invited to even give up that little bit unnatural separation and see that no, the wave was never separate from the ocean was never separate from the wave. So there is this non-duality, and in that, the thoughts, the ego, the wounds are all seen to have good intention. At the root of every wound, at the root of even the most violent tendencies, I truly believe there is a good intention. There is an attempt maybe to bring about peace or to bring about connection or to bring about safety, all by it's manifesting in quite unskillful ways. And so the real path for me is not about rejecting anything, but by coming more and more deeply into relationship with everything. When you do that, your deepest wounds, thoughts, emotions, it's like they feel this intimacy, which is more intimate, more loving than the most unconditionally loving mother and father in one. And as they receive that grace, they start growing up, they start transforming into the full potential of a human being. So the Buddhists sometimes describe enlightenment as it's the full realization of emptiness. It's the full realization that this is all empty, plus the full flourishing of all positive qualities, the full flourishing of the full potential of a human being. That full flourishing happens through relating to all these parts so that they can grow up in that light that we are, the light of the divine or the light of life itself, whatever you prefer to call it.
Yeah, there's a piece in there which you also shared quite casually, which I again double clicking. The root of all that is manifest, actually, in your opinion or your felt sense, comes from a positive intention. That is quite profound to recognize. Can you just like broaden that out a little bit more so we can, yeah, see that in a bit more light?
I had a mentor once tell me something beautiful. He said, "This is universally true always." And that kind of had me perk up because he would never say something like that. He's usually very nuanced, but he said, "This is universally true always. Whenever you're angry, there is deep care." And it just struck me. I'd never seen it like that. I was like, that's so true. Whenever I get angry about something, there is a much deeper care that I have somewhere. And that's really the essence of what I'm talking about here. If you go deep enough, most of the time, if not always, you're going to find this love, this movement of the heart, whether it's care, it's protectiveness, it's wanting harmony or unity. And I think the reason for that is that the very substance of this ocean that we're swimming in, called life or the universe, seems to have a quality of love in direct experience, right? It seems to have this potential, this deep goodness to it. It's not something the mind creates, but most of the masters that I've heard about, and in my own experience, the deeper I go into myself, I don't find hatred. I don't find destructiveness. What I find there is this deep quality of goodness, connectedness, flourishing. The better I feel, the more generous I feel about others. The more connected I am to myself, the easier it is to have patience for other people's suffering. So that's what I mean. At the root, there seems to be this goodness, and if we're acting out in ways that doesn't match that, it's almost always a sign that, oh my God, how disconnected I have become from the root of my own nature. And how can you be upset with someone for being disconnected? How can you judge yourself or shame yourself for being disconnected? I mean, that's just more disconnection.
Hey there, Inspired Soul. Join the conversation. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What is your biggest takeaway from today's conversation? Back to Mateo in today's episode. That also is a very profound point. I find oftentimes when people are not living into, let's say, an idealized version of themselves, but, you know, a version of themselves that they know is possible. One of the sneaky things that quickly pops in is this self-judgment. And in fact, it seems like, yeah, it's going to be the spark that sort of creates just enough friction for transformation to occur. But in fact, it's actually like it smothers the flame. It's like, it is this like the self-judgment piece actually entraps you further into like, oh, now you've stuck the energy that was potentially, encouraging the transformation. I see you smiling.
And the self-judgment is one of the favorite tricks of the ego mind, if we want to use that term. It's such an easy way to ground back into a pseudo sense of familiarity. So it's a protection mechanism, actually. That's what self-judgment is. So many people, of course, initially, if they don't see that, we feel victimized by our self-judgment, as if self-judgment is just something that's happening to me, right? Oh, but I just, the inner critic comes and it just judges me, etc. That's still not taking full accountability. That's still being a little bit in victim consciousness. It's not that the inner critic comes. I am the inner critic. I am judging myself and shaming myself because I get a perceived benefit from that. It gives me a sense of familiarity. It grounds me into something I think is safe. And if I don't judge myself in that moment, it might feel tremendously vulnerable.
So I'm leaning into your background to psychology here because that familiarity piece, we could trade the word familiarity for order. And there's those two forces forever at play, right? Like order, chaos, masculine, feminine. And you could almost argue that the ego structures, one of its prime responsibilities is to provide order as we navigate our way through what is ultimately, is it an illusion? Is it real? What is Maya? Chaos, right? And then it'd be rude of me not to sort of lean into where we started the podcast a little bit. Like you've spent 100 days in darkness, yeah, and like familiarity, like order must escape you to such a degree, but surely at some point you find order in other structures. Is this where your awareness of the heart becomes orderly, or like where does order appear when you have that much chaos in the darkness?
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, in my experience, the structuring that the ego or the order that the ego gives never ends because that is a function that we need. If we didn't have that structuring, I like to use the word structuring. If we didn't have that structuring as ego, we wouldn't be able to function in this reality, right? We would just sit, we wouldn't know where to put the food, we wouldn't know how to function. People would call our names, we wouldn't know it's referring to us. So that structuring is an indispensable part of operating within this existence without just floating into a mass of undifferentiation. But what does happen for the spiritual process, and as you bring your heart and these quote unquote spiritual qualities like compassion or peace, self acceptance, forgiveness, power, more into your experience, and you offer it to whatever state your ego is in now, whatever state those wounds or thoughts are in now, you relate to them from there instead of judgment. Those the level of structuring your ego is at, it starts evolving so that your ego starts becoming rooted in what I call authentic structure. There is a structuring that comes from the heart. So this is what I mean with when I mentioned before the mind is coming from the heart. Most people don't experience that because they are living in the mind first most of the time and the heart second. But for many of your viewers, they've already started that journey or are deep in that journey of living from the heart first. As you start doing that, what's infusing your ego, what's infusing your mind is your heart. It's that deeper force that's structuring your ego and your mind so that the ego and the mind are extensions of the heart. When how you live is what you become. So if you're living more from your heart, your ego and your mind start becoming structured. They start becoming more like your heart. So you can hold this capacity for individuality, boundaries, etc., but it's driven more and more by selfless, by a greater selflessness and knowing that we are all one. You still have the full capacity to protect your daughter. You still have the full capacity to go out into the world, have boundaries, ask for money, give money, and function in all these different ways. But it isn't as tight because there is this deeper love that's holding it. You know, deep inside, you're safe, you're okay. So that structure, that psychological structure, starts evolving in this. It's almost like as children, if we had grown up in an environment where there was love, there was a lot of mirroring, there was a lot of attunement, not only on a psychological level, but to our very essence, our very unique soul signature, those structures were going to form at that time. It just so happens that a lot of us in this day and age don't have societies or environments like that because everyone is traumatized at large. So, but the cool thing is, because these are qualities of our being, it's never too late to go through that developmental process. Our being has every ingredient for that developmental process because the only way that developmental process happens is through our being. Right? When you're with a friend and you're sharing something very difficult and your friend just meets you with so much compassion or just holds the space for you and something shifts in you, right? A lightness comes. That's them offering their being to you. They're just reminding you of your beingness.
I can't help but rest in this awareness at this particular juncture in the conversation. It feels like the heart does provide structure that does have walls and pillars, but they feel translucent. It's like transparent, and you can actually allow a lot of light in and out when you rest in that awareness. It's just a felt sense in this podcast at this particular conversation. I'm not sure if those people tuning in can feel it. And it seems like, and I guess this is what the Tibetans call heart mind, right? As opposed to what we've just been discussing, which is mind heart, which is kind of the inverse. And it feels like the mind is this sort of blackout blinds are down, and you sort of see yourself sort of echoed back around in there. And it's quite profound if you can sort of just feel into what mind heart feels like versus heart mind feels like. Is this the awareness of heart mind that the Buddhists speak of?
Yeah, it's what I mean when I use the heart mind for sure. I think many other Buddhists they use it in different ways, of course, but most definitely, it's one of my teachers used to call it being right side up. So many people would come and say, "Oh, I don't know what's happening with my life or my spiritual process. Everything is turning like on its head, right? It's turning the wrong side." And you would say, "No, it's turning right side up." It feels only like things are falling on their head from the perspective of the mind. But from the perspective of the heart, there's faith. There is I don't even know how I ended up here, right? Somehow I find myself in this magical experience called life. So how the hell would I know what's supposed to happen, right? It's the mind that has these ideas and bless its heart, but it creates so much suffering to insist on reality needing to be a certain way which it isn't. So the heart just surrenders, and in that surrender it can start infusing gradually the mind in its neurotic tendencies and its anxiousness. I often view the unintegrated mind as a scared child, and a scared child, you want to give it compassion. You don't want to try to kill it off or like drown it or just push it off a cliff in the name of surrender, right? You want to give it compassion. You want to hold it, and gradually it will grow up and trust more.
For those people tuning in at this particular juncture in the conversation, this is super inspiring. But practically, how do we integrate this awareness into our day-to-day lives, and how does it enrich us?
There is this wonderful Zen quote that is quite famous where a guy asked the teacher, he says, I don't have time to meditate 2 hours a day. I just don't. And the Zen master says, well, if you don't have time to meditate 2 hours, you need 4 hours. So the first thing I would recommend is everybody needs time for meditation. Now, meditation doesn't mean you have to sit still, cross-legged. It can be anything that feeds your soul. For some people, that's just walking in nature. For some people, it can be journaling. You can even sit. One of my favorite practices to recommend to people is take a cup of tea or something without caffeine if that's your vibe, and just sit for 15 minutes. Just sit and enjoy that cup. Don't do anything. You don't have to meditate. So everybody needs this kind of rejuvenation, especially in the time of overstimulation. That's one of the big challenges I find in this day and age is just total overstimulation. We're not built for this level of stimulation. Even the computers, I mean, they're the computers, the marketing, and when you go to 7-Eleven, when you look at the candy bars or the colors, they're so exaggerated. We're not used to that level of exaggerated color spectrum, right? So even that is like overstimulating us constantly. So we need to bring in antidotes and medicines. At the very least, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour a day. We need to carve out that time where I can just be in my own space. That gives the soul a chance to start pouring its light in through this 3D body. When the mind relaxes, the soul loves opportunities like that. Oh, finally, right? He's not keeping himself busy. Okay, let me just pour some wisdom, some light, some rejuvenation in. So that's the first thing I would say is totally non-negotiable, totally essential for all of us. Just carve out time every day to reconnect, whatever that is for you. Second, um, one of the most powerful practices, this is the third step in my in the awareness method I created, which is 3 steps, and is to follow your heart. And it's because this is by far the most powerful practice I've found when it comes to this process of maturation and spiritual awakening. The heart has this kind of blueprint. Because your whole ego arose from the heart, it's been constructed with the heart as foundation. It also knows the way to undo everything it's constructed and build it up in a more powerful and a more sustainable, resourced way. So by following your heart, you start actually undoing your fear. You get confronted with all these places where you don't trust, where you don't have faith, and you get invited to integrate faith or trust or willpower or individuality or unity. All these qualities that are part of a whole human being, you get to integrate through that process. A lot of people ask me, "What? Well, I don't know what my heart is. If we feel quite disconnected, we don't know what is the heart." And I always say, well, just do your best, right? Just start with your best intention. You won't get it right, especially in the beginning. You're going to think you are moving from your heart, from a deeper impulse, and then you realize it was your greed or it was your vanity or something else that was moving you. That's fine. That's going to feel painful. So there is this feedback mechanism that's wonderful. It's called suffering. When you move from disconnection, you suffer. And that's really powerful. If you can start viewing that as a feedback mechanism instead of I did something wrong and now I'm suffering, then it's gradually the compass starts realigning and coming to your heart. You become more and more familiar with what is the voice of your heart and what isn't. So those two practices I think can take people really far. In essence, you have everything you need for the whole journey there because your heart is an alive instrument and it's always updating depending on the phase and stage you're in. It's going to take you to different things. So in some stages, I was just sitting on a mountain for 3.5 years in stillness, and then at some point my heart said, well, what's the point in this? This is enough. You've already integrated this. Now we need to go dance. We need to get involved in business again and relationships. So the heart is always attuning to what is the next step that is needed for your evolution.
Mateo, it's interesting because following the heart seems to be this advice that a lot of people hear. But one of the key things in there is for so many people, that advice is laden with so much fear. People are so scared to actually enact, to move into that space, to actually follow through on what feels like their heart. What do you say to those people that confront fear? And it's like, follow your heart. And it's like they can feel there's something in there. But when they go to like walk towards it, it's like, oh, nah. What do you say to that?
There was this book titled Only Fear Dies, and I never read the book, but I like that title. So anything that can leave us, anything that could be lost, surely is not of our deepest essence. Another thing I like is that courage, by its very definition, is only existing in relationship to fear, right? So the fact that I can be courageous in the steps I take points to the fact that there is a fear, right? If there wasn't fear, there wouldn't be any courage needed. And so I would say it can be very powerful to view this journey of life and overcoming these fears as the adventure that you signed up for. I mean, what else are you going to do here? Just live in a little box and then um, convince yourself that everything is under control because you're not following your heart, and then eventually you're going to come to the realization that, oh my god, it wasn't under control because I'm going to die, right? So the deepest anxiety we have is about death, the deepest denial and anxiety. And so many times I thought, oh no, I don't have that anymore, and I'm free from that. And then a deeper layer, it reveals itself, and I realize, oh my god, this rabbit hole of believing in an eternal self goes so deep, right? We have this deep need to believe in an eternal self. And that's one of the things that makes the Buddhist teachings actually different from some of the other spiritual traditions, because they take even that step and say, no, there is no such thing as an eternally enduring permanent self. It's a quite radical leap of faith there, or not leap of faith, but it's a quite radical proposition they're making there, because it's inviting the psychology into giving up even that last fear of there being a permanent enduring self. And if there isn't a permanent enduring self, then I don't have anything to protect anymore. I get to discover myself moment by moment by moment. And each time you follow your heart, it's actually an opportunity to realize that, because the one afraid of following your heart is not the same one that follows the heart. And the one that followed the heart is not the same one as the one you will become. So you start, as you follow your heart, you start seeing this holy dynamism of the universe, that it's always transforming, it's always moving it into its next shape. And you are that transformation, you are that evolution. You don't exist as this separate static point. You are this constant motion. And if you're stuck in the mind, your whole attempt is going to be to try to convince yourself that you are this static separate point. Somehow everything else is totally changing in constant evolution, but me, no, I have a capacity to step out of it all, to exist here separately. It just doesn't make sense. So, and it takes tremendous energy. But if you can just soften a little bit about that, around that idea, around that fear, you might discover that, oh my God, I am part of the flow. I never stood outside of the great flow, the great spirit of God, of the universe, for even a moment. Even in my deepest conviction that I'm so separate, that was only possible as a wave in the ocean. As we start seeing that, we kind of get the joke. What's the point? I cannot be separate. That may seem scary to the mind, but the good news is then you also cannot be destroyed. There's just transformation.
Yeah, it's really interesting feeling into the Tibetan awareness on mind as well, because as I've started studying some of their teachings on death, there's this fascinating component on the quality of mind that you carry towards death. And actually, that state of mind at that final frontier, as the ego knows it, actually sets your trajectory into the bardos, which is a fascinating take on death as well. Yeah, your insights
I
into
would
that?
say I would say to everyone, please live your life in a way so that if you're lucky enough to have a conscious death, for some of us it happens suddenly, right? But if you're lucky enough to see or have a sense of your impending death, live your life in a way where you can be excited and joyous about that final moment. Because truly, some traditions view it as the greatest moment of one's life. And some Buddhist traditions, they actually practice their whole practice, a whole lifetime of practice to that most important point of how am I going to leave this incredible party called life on earth, right? So I think a true sign of a life really well lived is that you go with a smile, you go with excitement. Oh my God, I surrendered and surrendered and surrendered and surrendered, moment after moment after moment. And now comes this big final moment as far as we know, right? As far as I know, but I want to surrender into this moment with fullness and then discover what's after that.
Yeah, it's a massive invitation into really understanding the impermanence and the non-attachment that is espoused in that space, because ultimately you will untether even from your body. Yeah, and the interesting thing in today's conversation is we've talked a lot about the propensity of the mind, and I'd love to get your take on how much of what we carry in the mind structure do you think is karmically influenced based on our journeys, based on karma?
Yeah, there's so many perspectives to look at this from. So if we look at it from the perspective of Mateo or Amrit being a separate mind stream that exists separately, yeah, we could say it's all karma, right? It's all the genetic line and past lives, etc. Whatever the perspective that one believes in, that's moving, that's continuing to move. But if we look at it from a more absolute or wholeness perspective, there is no individual karma in a sense, right? It's all the memory of consciousness itself. So from that perspective, it doesn't even really make sense to talk about individual past lives. It's more like a big cloud, a big database of infinite potentials, as Cleopatra, as the slave, as the torturer, as the princess, as just a full spectrum of experience that consciousness can have. And who knows why those certain memories are showing up in consciousness in this particular formation of Mateo in his brain. So we can look at it from both perspectives, both a very personal perspective and a less personal perspective. And each one has value depending on the stage you're in and the moment you're in. And that's really one of the Look, the big liberation I find in life and the big developmental, what all of this development is leading to, in my experience, is just being able to take on more and more perspectives without conflict. So there is this saying that says a good sign of an enlightened mind is it can hold tremendous paradox without conflict, right? Because the polarity has ended or it's very diminished. So consciousness or God, the Great Spirit, has this capacity to take infinite perspectives and experience itself through infinite viewpoints. Now, it is possible to get closer and closer to that while in a human form. As you develop, you can take on so many different perspectives. So you can take on the perspective that the ego is good and it needs time to develop. You can take on the perspective that the ego just needs to be kind of met quite fiercely and you need to transcend it and there is no conflict. You have all these perspectives that you can take depending on, in Buddhism, what we will call skillful means, depending on what is most skillful to the moment you're in. So it gives you this tremendous flexibility to meet the moment more and more powerfully. So yes, if you're talking with someone who still very much believes that they are just a separate individual and it's really important for some kind of healing that they like get seen or name one of their past lives and it's really going to move something for them, you can meet that person in that. You can meet yourself in that. But if you're talking with someone who maybe is a little bit too identified with this personal story of a self that's moving and that's keeping them a little bit stuck, you can say, well, where is your mind stream even? What is this unique self that you talk about? Can it be found? Right? There is this great story of a seeker who seeks enlightenment and he's practiced for decades and he hears about this master and he travels like over mountains for months and he gets there and he meets the master and the master just ignores him, right? He doesn't want anything to do with him. So this guy comes back day after day and he's sitting and he finally says to the master, I'm going to chop off my arm if you don't help me become enlightened. The master just kind of shrugs and he leaves. So this guy chops off one arm in the story. And he comes back the next day. He says, I'll chop off my other arm if you don't give me enlightenment. And so he chops off the other arm. And then finally the master comes out after like the seventh day. Who knows how many limbs this guy has left at that point, right? And he says, all right, What do you want? He says, I want enlightenment. And the master says, show me the self that's going to get enlightened, and I'm going to give you enlightenment. And they say that in that moment, this guy has this realization that there isn't that separate personal self in the way that he believed it. And he attains enlightenment. So it's all a matter of perspective. And each stage, a different perspective is helpful for us.
And I think that also speaks volumes to such a beautiful story.
Little
Arrogance.
gory, but gets the
Yeah.
point across.
Yeah, definitely. And also because there's a big part of your teachings that I'm landing in here, which is, the journey starts with the heart, we come back to the heart. It speaks a lot to the cycles and the cyclical nature of it all. And even at this particular juncture, enlightenment isn't a one and done sort of thing. It sounds like it's like a progressive lightening of the load in some ways.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love that perspective. It seems it's usually only the mind that has an interest in announcing that it has reached a static place, and I finally made it, and that is done. The rest of the universe can stop its total full dynamism because I have arrived, and this is the end. There was another quote that says, there will be no one to witness your enlightenment, just like there will be no one to stand as a witness. Just like you can't witness your own funeral, you cannot be there to witness your own enlightenment. So it seems it is the mind that has this need to conclude that I have arrived somewhere static. There is only motion. I mean, there's only the flow of life.
The dynamism and the motion piece is quite profound, because for the longest, well, even as a meditation teacher, stillness was such a big part of my teachings, my own awareness, and coming into stillness. And it's probably been, I'm struggling to date this awareness, but we had a very interesting teacher on recently, named Bayo Malafe, and he again spoke to sort of presence and stillness as somewhat, not presence so much, but stillness as a bit of as a bit of a folly, because everything is always dynamic, it's always in motion, it's always in movement. And post the other side of that conversation with him, one of the things that inadvertently started to percolate for me in my awareness was the difference between present and presence. And this became really profound, because I think for the longest while, like teaching people to slow down, like you said, there's a real need and an antidote available for the societal sort of dysfunctions that we suffer from at the moment, to slow down and become present. But oftentimes, I think at large, we conflate being present with being in presence, if that makes sense. The presence kind of being that connection that we feel when we are present. And so the dynamism piece is quite profound, because, yeah, I've been reflecting, like, even when we come into complete stillness here on the earth, actually the earth is spiraling around the sun, and the sun is spiraling around the Milky. It's like everything's always moving. Like, you finally come to a resting point amongst the motion, but actually the dynamism that you're speaking to is actually always at play. Because I think there is a part of some people's mind tuning into this podcast that's going to be like, we're speaking to dynamism, but yet stillness is a whole spiritual path and practice. But recognizing that they're not at odds with each other. But I feel like for me now, being present is like a precursor to invite presence in. And then in the presence, you start to realize the dance and the majesty of it all to some degree.
Beautiful. I love that. And I really am hearing you speak to the stillness in motion, or the stillness that transcends both stillness and dynamism, which I would call the great stillness or the great Tao. It's been called many things. And so the practical practice of becoming still is very helpful. It's a scaffolding, as you say, it's not the end destination, it's a scaffolding for the great release. So you cannot go from being totally caught in neurotic thinking to having great release and great surrender into great freedom. It's not going to lead anywhere. You need a base. You need a place on the mountain to jump off First, you need to have a solid grounding on the mountain, and then you can jump off. You cannot jump from the ground. If you jump from the ground, you're just gonna probably make a funny YouTube clip. That's gonna be it, right? So the practice of stillness, which many of these traditions practice, and the practice of purification, the practice of being compassionate, those are all scaffolding practices, building your structure, your inner structuring to a certain degree where it can handle completely letting go of even the idea, the approximation of stillness or compassion. Because, of course, we cannot be compassionate as an intention truly. Compassion at its highest stage is spontaneous action, and it doesn't look a particular way. It can look all kinds of ways. So, what I'm really hearing you speak to is using these scaffoldings. And then eventually you got to let go of the scaffolding, right? You use the raft to cross the lake, but on the other side, you don't take the raft and take it with you around. So at the higher stages, we let go of even those scaffoldings, which really means your mind is no longer judging and checking whether your direct experience matches some spiritual ideal it has. That's what we're really talking about.
Mateo, for those people that do want to dive off the cliff and hopefully not make funny YouTube videos, but dive in deep, obviously I'm going to put a link to all your books in the show notes below, but you also offer, there's some courses coming up. There's also some, like a retreat. Yeah, tell us more about how people that want to dive in deeper with you have the opportunity to build more structure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a 1 day intro course that is coming up along with a 5 month container. I do once a year, I do a 5 month longer container for people who really want to go deep. And it's very practical practice. So it's practical and sitting in the transmission of everything we've been talking about, because that's what creates transformation, not just having the theory. Another easy entry point to my work is getting the awareness book, my latest book. It's a great intro to kind of what I do. I also do one-on-one work where I mix psychology, trauma work, and spiritual awakening, because to me they're very related, and it's just this process of human development and coming into our full potential as a human being. So those are some of the options I have.
And also, I think one of the things that I couldn't help but notice researching more and more of your work, your teachings are always tailored to the individual. It's very prescriptive based on the individual. Certain individuals could have certain things manifest, and the prescription would be a certain thing, whereas a different individual, something slightly different. It's not. It's definitely not a one size shoe fits all, which I think takes. It'd be easier if it wasn't that, you know. So it takes a certain level of work on your part in order to facilitate such journeys as well.
Yeah, it takes just attunement and feeling the person in front of you, just like, any good father or mother would. We do that with our children or with our friends or with our brothers and sisters, right? Ideally, we're feeling into what's present instead of coming with our own preconceived notions of who they are, and also who they should be or where they should go. I think it's only when we let go of that we can actually be available to the person in front of us. And I know you know that deeply because I feel you doing it in your podcast, right? You're just dropping in, you're attuned with the person in front of you, and then magic can emerge from that.
Thank you for that humbling reflection. What we all start to drop into our heart. Instead of living from mind heart, we live in heart mind. What do you see as the promised potential of humanity at large? Imagine if everybody embraced this awareness, these teachings. What do you see as an inspired evolution for tomorrow?
It's an interesting question, and honestly, I just cannot even go there. This nothing comes, and I think part of it is just that this deeper recognition, how I experience it, that this is so perfect already, and it is just perfection that's continuing to evolve if we allow it, but it is already so perfect. If we were to have a totally perfect utopian world, that would actually, if we haven't developed to be with that, that's actually going to highlight our suffering even more, just as it did for me when I was 23. On the outside, I got everything I had longed for, and that just reflected that something was still missing. So I think the most powerful, how I hold it, the most powerful thing we can do is to work on ourselves in this present moment and live more and more in that state of heaven and heaven on earth internally. And then we can deal with many kinds of situation, whether they're hell realms or whether they're heaven realms that we manifest externally on this planet. Of course, I'm all for a utopia. I'm all for a planet that's full of love and peace, 100%. But again, I think the focus should be on creating that internally first and being okay with both hell realms and heaven realms outside. I think that's the way we can actually have that utopian freedom. If we're too attached, see, it's all attachment, right? Attachment and aversion. If I'm too attached to things being perfect, I become aggressive. Inadvertently, I might become aggressive when things don't feel how I think they should be.
Mateo, anything else you'd like to share with us before I wrap up today's podcast?
Yeah, I would say to everyone listening, first, thank you for listening and hopefully receiving what Amrit and I have been sharing today, because that is your very own resonance that we're all sitting in together. And just take one step at a time. Remember, there's infinite time, quite literally. Okay, there is infinite time, so there is no rush to get anywhere. And yet, holding that as the bigger perspective, also don't waste time. Be urgent in your living, be immediate. So hold both of these perspectives. There is no rush. Everything is fine as it is. Everything is perfect. But also embody the urgency and really go for it. View this as if this is the one life you have. And with one life, I mean just this moment. If you can view it like that while also holding that there is nothing wrong and everything is good, that in my experience makes for a beautiful, beautiful life, no matter how it looks like from the outside or according to the mind's perspective.
Mateo. Thank you so much. Oh, man, Brother Bear, for such an incredible podcast. Really appreciate you taking out the time, carving out the energy to be with us here today. And then also today's podcast, it's so obvious it stands on the shoulders of so much of your own life's journey, meanderings, dark caves, dark places, light places, high mountains. Yeah, and I'm sure we've just scratched the surface. There's so many other stories yet to be unpacked. But yeah, just want to take that moment to thank you for today. Absolutely. And then also thanking you for you, brother man, and the work that you're doing in the world. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you.
My deep pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
You inspired soul, thank you so much for your inspirations to evolve. You made it through to the end of another incredible episode. It is such an honor to be your brother, walking this incredible path by your side. To all of you that have subscribed to the channel, I just want to take a moment out to thank all of you. Thank you so much for your incredible love and support. Everything you see around here is powered and empowered by your subscription to the channel. Could not be possible doing what we are without your support. Thank you so much. To all of you that haven't yet subscribed, please do take a moment, hit the subscribe button, hit that bell notification icon. It helps with everything we're doing here, championing love, positivity, and wisdom around the planet. On screen now, a conversation with Robert J. Gilbert from the Vestitas Institute. The Rosicrucians have incredible insights for you to dive into, and another couple of episodes on screen for you that YouTube has handpicked for you based on your viewing preference to dive in even deeper to keep your inspirations evolving. I'll see you in the next one. Go on. Take your pick, make your click. I'll see you there.